Welcome back, everyone. This brings us to the end of our initial section on the high-level or fundamental overview of the overall structure of virtual networks and also IP addressing, especially when it comes to the relationships between subnets and the virtual network itself. Before we move on to our next section, which will cover the fundamentals of DNS, let's quickly review what we learned and also introduce the case study that we are going to refer to at the section conclusions of this course, which will put all of our learned principles into practice. Reviewing what we learned in this section, we started off with the high-level fundamental overview of the main concepts of how Azure networking works, in which we learned that the virtual network, or a VNet, is your primary core of Azure networking, especially when working with private networking. And we also learned that Azure virtual networks are bound to a single region, which will come into play when we discuss how to create multi-regional interconnected networks both in Azure and outside of Azure later on in this course. And we also learned that the virtual network is your primary hub for a wide variety of communications, including VNet to VNet, hybrid connections, and much more as well. We then moved on to take a closer look at how IP addressing works, in which there are a number of different configurations we need to be familiar with. We learned how IP addresses are actually attached to a network interface, which is then attached to our individual virtual machine. And we also took a closer look at the relationship between an address range and a subnet within that address range on a virtual network. We viewed some of the basics of working with private IP ranges, which also includes some of the restrictions that we are not allowed to use. And then we finished off by breaking down the wide variety of IP types or configurations, which include dynamic versus static, private versus public, and basic versus standard SKU. We then moved on into a bit of an interesting topic, which is going to be another one of those ongoing themes, which is subnet delegation, which is the process Azure uses to inject an external managed service directly into your virtual network. Or in other words, a subnet will be dedicated for that external service to act as if it is an internal virtual network service. From which we also learn about the different implementation methods that vary specific to the service, which again is going to be an ongoing topic when we are discussing a variety of managed networking services later on in this course. Moving on, I want to introduce the little bit of a fun case study scenario we are going to refer to throughout the rest of this course to kind of put some of these principles in each section into practice with a fictional company we like to call Control Alt Sweets. Control Alt Sweets is an award-winning fictional bakery which makes the most delicious cakes and other confectionery delights. After all, everybody likes cake, and there will be plenty of cake in this course. At the moment, our company of Control Alt Sweets is experiencing rapid growth in which their footprint is expanding worldwide. As a result, they must work to increase their network presence, and at the moment, they are very interested in extending their existing on-premises networking assets into Azure in order to scale out as needed. So, based on what we've learned in this initial fundamental section, let's think about how Control Alt Suites can begin the migration process of building out their initial Azure Virtual Network infrastructure. Starting off at the beginning, which is where we are at right now, they need to first plan their central network starting point, from which the best method of doing so is to create an initial landing zone in the central US region, which is where our company is hosted in, from which they're going to create their initial virtual network they're going to name Cake Hub VNet 01. This initial virtual network is going to act as a hub for further expansion. Looking forward, we are going to discuss multiple virtual network architecture, specifically hub and spoke networks, and this is going to act as our initial virtual networking hub. Next, we need to plan out our initial subnet addressing. After all, we need a subnet to host our different Azure resources, from which we will create our first subnet to host our initial website, which for the time being is just going to be hosted on a single virtual machine. From which we learned that our subnet range of 10.0.10/24 fits inside of our network address range of 10.0.0/16. And then finally, Control Alt Suites has decided to implement the Azure Bastion service for secure access to their private virtual machines on their virtual network. Now, this course is not going to be a deep dive into the Azure Bastion service itself. However, relating back to our previous discussions in this section, we learned that Azure Bastion is one of a number of network managed services that require delegated or a dedicated subnet that only that service will be using. As a quick reminder for an exam focus, you will be expected to know which managed Azure networking services require their own dedicated subnet, and from our previous lesson, we learned that Azure Bastion is one of those services. In this case, Azure Bastion does require a specific naming convention for a subnet, which we have on the right side as well. With that, that's going to conclude our introductory section on the fundamentals of Azure networking. Let's now move on to the next section, which is going to cover another fundamental networking topic, which will be DNS, especially how it relates to Azure, and I will see you then.